The moment Eudora Bristol heard the words leave Harlan Cook's mouth, the entire world tilted sideways. "Keep him as long as you need," the wide cattleman had said, gesturing at the tall, quiet man standing just behind his left shoulder like a shadow made solid. "George Turner is the best hand I have ever had on this range. He will get your land back in order. I give him to you freely, and he answers to you until the work is done." But it was not the generous offer that made Eudora's chest crack open like dry timber under a boot heel. It was the look on George Turner's face when those words landed, not the passive, dutiful expression of a working man being shuffled from one job to the next. It was something raw and flickering, something between dread and recognition, as if he already knew her. As if this moment had always been coming for him, and he had spent years bracing for the collision. Eudora stood at the edge of what had once been her father's porch, the boards warped and splintered beneath her boots, the front door hanging slightly off its upper hinge. Behind her, the ruin of the Bristol homestead stretched out in every direction, scorched fence posts and toppled water troughs and fields gone to weed and hardpan. 3 weeks she had been back. 3 weeks since the telegram reached her in Santa Fe. 3 weeks since she had buried her father in the red soil of the small family plot near the creek. 3 weeks since she had discovered the full depth of the disaster that had swallowed everything he had worked to build. And now Harlan Cook stood at the foot of her broken porch steps in his fine brown coat and his silver belt buckle, hat in hand, offering her the most capable man on the Cook range as if it were nothing more than lending a neighbor a good axe. "I cannot accept such a thing," Eudora said, and her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "You can and you will," Harlan said, not unkindly. He was a large man, broad across the chest and shoulders, somewhere past 50, with the slow confidence of someone who had never once been told no by the land itself. "Your father, God rest him, was a proud man, too proud to ask for help when the drought hit and the fence lines started going. I should have pushed harder. I owe your family this much." Eudora looked at George Turner again. He had still not spoken a single word. He stood with his hat held at his side in one large, weathered hand, the other hand resting loose at his thigh, not near the holster but near enough that you noticed. He was somewhere in his early 30s, lean but built solidly, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at the ends where it had grown past his collar. His jaw was set and his eyes were the complicated color of creek water over flat stone, somewhere between gray and green, watchful in a way that unsettled her and steadied her in the same breath. "Does he have a say in the matter?" Eudora asked directly, looking past Harlan entirely. George Turner blinked. It was the first movement he had made since they arrived. "Miss Bristol," he said, and his voice was lower than she expected, careful and deliberate in the way of someone who had learned long ago to choose words like ammunition, only spending what was necessary. "I have a say, and I am saying yes." That was where it began, not with fireworks or declarations or the slow, beautiful machinery of courtship that Eudora had read about in the few novels she had managed to keep from her mother's collection. It began with a broken porch and a big man's generosity, and a quiet ranch hand saying yes with the weight of someone who meant it in more ways than the words implied. But to truly understand what happened between Eudora Bristol and George Turner in the summer and fall of 1883 in the Brazos River country of West Texas, you have to go back further. You have to understand what Eudora had come home to, and what George Turner was carrying when he arrived, and why a simple act of borrowed labor turned into the kind of love story that neither one of them had any defense against. Eudora Bristol was 26 years old when she came back to the ranch. She had been living in Santa Fe for 4 years, working as a schoolteacher at a small mission school, sending money home when she could, receiving letters from her father that were always shorter and quieter than she would have liked. Her father, James Bristol, had been a stubborn optimist of the old frontier variety, a man who had homesteaded that stretch of Brazos country in 1861 with nothing but a horse, a young wife, and a belief that the land would reward hard work with abundance. For many years it had. The Bristol Ranch had run a decent cattle operation through the 1870s, not the grand empire that men like Harlan Cook commanded, but honest and self-sustaining. Then the droughts began. Then the big cattle operations pushed the market prices down. Then Eudora's mother had died of fever in the winter of 1879, and James Bristol had quietly begun to come apart at the seams in the way that grief sometimes disassembles people without anyone quite noticing until the damage is done. By the time Eudora arrived in March of 1883, her father had been gone 3 weeks. He had died in his sleep, the neighboring family told her, just did not wake up. The doctor said his heart had been failing for some time. What the doctor did not say, and what Eudora pieced together over her first 2 weeks back, was that the ranch had also been quietly dying. The cattle herd was down to 11 animals. 2 of the 3 fence lines on the south pasture had collapsed. The well had gone partially dry. The barn roof had a breach in it big enough to see sky through. And there was debt, not catastrophic but real and present and demanding attention, owed to a supply merchant in the nearest town of Caldwell, about 20 miles east. Eudora was not a woman who fell apart easily. She had been raised on this land, had worked cattle and mended fence and ridden hard since she was old enough to hold a rope. But she was one person, and the scope of what needed doing was enormous. And when Harlan Cook came riding out on a Tuesday morning in the second week of April with his quiet offer, she was exhausted in a way that went all the way down to the bone. George Turner, she would learn, had been with Harlan Cook's Rocking Sea operation for 6 years. He had arrived in West Texas in 1877 as part of a cattle drive-up from the south, had stayed on after the drive concluded, and had worked his way from a seasonal hand to Harlan's top man in a way that earned him both respect and a kind of isolated loneliness. He was good at everything that mattered on a working ranch. He could read cattle the way some men read books. He could repair almost anything with limited materials and considerable ingenuity. He could manage a difficult horse with patience that bordered on supernatural. He was the kind of man other hands followed not because he demanded it, but because he simply knew what needed doing and did it first. What people on the Rocking Sea did not know about George Turner, and what Eudora would not know for some time, was that he had come to West Texas running from something. Not the law, which was the assumption men usually made about quiet strangers, and not another man, which was the other usual assumption. George Turner had come to Texas running from a version of himself that he was terrified of becoming. He had grown up in Missouri in a family where the men were hard and cold, and the women bore it because there was no alternative. His father had been a man of enormous capability and zero tenderness, and George had spent his entire young adulthood terrified that he was the same, that whatever warmth he reached for would curdle in his hands. That connection was a trap that would ultimately expose some darkness in him that he did not yet know the shape of, so he had kept himself at a careful distance from everyone. He worked hard, he was fair, he was respected, and he was alone. He told himself it was preference. He had almost convinced himself it was true. When Harlan Cook had come to him privately, the evening before they rode out to the Bristol place, George had listened to the plan with his usual stillness. The Bristol girl came home to a disaster, Harlan had said, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey in the small office of the main house. Her father was a good man, and I did not help him enough when I should have. I am not going to make the same mistake with his daughter. I want to send you over there to get that ranch functioning again. For how long? George had asked. As long as it takes. George had considered the whiskey in his glass for a long time. You could send a crew. I could, Harlan agreed. But what she needs is not just labor. She needs someone steady who can think and plan and be there through the whole of it. I trust you more than I trust anyone else I have got. It was the highest compliment Harlan Cook had ever paid him, and George had felt the familiar conflict of wanting to accept it and being afraid of what accepting it would ask of him, because he had heard about Eudora Bristol. Not much and nothing specific, but enough. The schoolteacher who had come home, the daughter of James Bristol, who everyone said was as capable as any man and twice as proud about it. He had said yes to Harlan that night. He told himself it was out of loyalty and obligation, and the simple logic of a man being useful where he was needed. He did not examine the other reason, the flicker of something he could not name that had made the yes come out before the doubt could stop it. The first morning George arrived at the Bristol ranch at sunup with his horse, his tools, his saddle gear, and one canvas bag of personal belongings. Eudora met him at the gate with a cup of coffee and a list written on the back of an old feed receipt. The list had 14 items on it. "I ranked them by urgency," she said, handing it over without preamble. "The well is first. If we do not have reliable water, nothing else matters." George took the list and read it carefully. He read the whole thing twice, which she noticed and appreciated, and then he folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. "Do you have a dowsing rod?" he asked. "I do not believe in dowsing rods," she said. "Neither do I," he said, with the very faint beginning of something that might eventually become a smile. "But I know what to look for in the ground. I will need to walk the creek line this morning." "I will come with you," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Not the way men usually looked at her, which was either with an assessment of her suitability or a calculation of her weakness. He looked at her the way someone looks at a map, with genuine attention, trying to understand the territory. "All right," he said. They walked the creek line together that first morning and spoke very little and listened to each other's silences in a way that was already different from ordinary silence. Eudora pointed out where her father had last dug before abandoning the second water source. George crouched and pressed his palm to the earth and looked at the way the moss grew on the creek stones and the angle of the bank, and eventually stood up and said, "There is still water here. It is deeper than your father was willing to go, but it is here." "How do you know?" she asked. "The cattails," he said, pointing along the bank. "They do not grow like that unless there is subsurface water within 20 feet of the surface, and the ground here has a different sound when you walk on it, hollow rather than dead." She had pressed her own boot to the earth right beside where his had been, and she had listened, and after a moment she thought she understood what he meant, hollow rather than dead. There was something still alive underneath. That first week was purely functional. George worked from before sunrise until the light failed, and Eudora worked beside him for most of it, which he had not expected but quickly came to depend on. She was not in his way. She was the kind of worker who watched what needed doing and did it, who did not need to be told twice, and did not pretend helplessness as a strategy. When they worked together on the fence line, she handed him tools before he reached for them, and when they moved cattle, she read the animals almost as well as he did, keeping herself in exactly the right position without him having to direct her. By the end of the first week, they had a deeper well with clean water, 2 of the 3 collapsed fence sections repaired, and the barn roof patched with reclaimed lumber from a fallen outbuilding on the east side of the property. The work was still enormous, but there was momentum now, that particular quality of forward motion that changes the feeling of a task from impossible to merely difficult. On the 7th evening, Eudora cooked supper for both of them at the house, which George ate at the kitchen table while she sat across from him, and it was the first time they had been still and in proximity to each other without a task between them. The awkwardness of it lasted about 30 seconds, and then Eudora asked him how he had ended up in West Texas, and he told her the short version. Missouri, the cattle drive, staying on with the rocking sea. She listened the way good listeners listen, without filling the pauses which drew more out of him than he intended to give. He asked her about Santa Fe. She told him about the mission school, about the children she had taught, mostly the children of Spanish-speaking families in the area, and there was a light in her face when she talked about it that was different from the determined efficiency he had seen all week. Softer, more personal. "Do you miss it?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "I miss the children," she said honestly. "I miss having a purpose that felt like mine rather than one that was handed to me by circumstance." "Is that what this feels like? Circumstance?" She looked at him steadily across the table. She had dark auburn hair pulled back practically at her neck and brown eyes that were direct and intelligent and gave away less than he expected given how expressive her voice was. "This land is my family's blood," she said. "I do not want to be anywhere else, but I did not choose to come back like this. I chose to leave the way I did, and I did not choose the terms of the return. There is a difference." "Yes," he said quietly, "there is." He did not explain why he understood that so precisely, but something in the way he said it told her he did, and she filed it away with the careful attention of someone building a picture out of pieces. 3 weeks in, something happened that changed the texture of everything. Eudora was riding the southern boundary on a Tuesday afternoon when she found a section of fence that had not simply collapsed from neglect, but had been deliberately cut. The wire was snipped clean, not broken or stretched. Someone had come onto the Bristol property and removed a 30-foot section of boundary fence, and through that gap, a portion of what she could only assume was a neighboring herd had been grazing the south pasture for God only knew how long. She came back to the ranch at a hard canter and found George working the water pump mechanism in the yard, and she told him what she had found. He went still in a way that she was beginning to recognize, not inactive but processing. "When did you last ride that section?" he asked. 10 days ago, she said. "It was intact then." "Who runs cattle on the land that borders your south line?" "A man named Roy Peckett," she said, and watched George's expression do something complicated. "You know him," she said immediately. George set down the wrench he had been holding. "I know of him. He has had a running boundary dispute with the Rocking Sea on our southwest corner for 2 years. He has never produced documentation to support his claims, but he makes them repeatedly and loudly, and twice in that time we found Rocking Sea fence cut." "You think he is trying to absorb land through encroachment," Eudora said flatly. "I think it is a real possibility," George said. "With your father gone and the ranch looking as it did when you arrived, someone like Peckett would see opportunity. If cattle graze a section long enough and the original owner does not actively push back, it complicates the legal standing of the boundary." Eudora felt something cold and clean move through her chest. Not fear, clarity. "How long has this been going on?" "I do not know," George said, "but we are going to find out." This was when the dynamic between them shifted from employee and employer to something closer to partners, though neither of them used that word or acknowledged the shift in any direct way. They spent the next 3 days riding every inch of boundary line on the Bristol property, documenting what they found. 2 more cut fence sections on the south and southwest boundaries. Evidence of regular cattle traffic through the gaps over a period that George estimated was at least 2 months, possibly longer. And most damning, a rough camp on the far southern reach of the Bristol pasture, just inside the cut fence line, with the ashes of old fires and the tracks of shod horses, men who had been spending time on land that was not theirs. "He has been moving on this property since before my father died," Eudora said quietly when they sat together over the notes she had made at the kitchen table that evening. Her voice was even, but George heard what was underneath it. "It looks that way," he said carefully. "My father was failing and dying, and someone was stealing his land while he was too weak to stop it." She pressed her palm flat on the table. "That is not something I am going to sit still for." "No," George said. "I did not expect you would." They rode into Caldwell the next morning, Eudora in the seat of the small wagon she had repaired with George's help, George on horseback beside her. She had her father's land deed and her own carefully made notes, and she spent 2 hours with the county land office registrar, a thin, meticulous man named Harold Spence, who reviewed every document she placed before him with the professional caution of someone who understood the combustible nature of land disputes. At the end of 2 hours, Harold Spence confirmed that the Bristol boundary lines were legally clear and fully registered, that there was no documentation supporting any Peckett claim to the south pasture, and that the evidence of deliberate fence cutting combined with unauthorized grazing constituted a legally actionable trespass. "You will want to speak to Sheriff Dawes," Spence said, looking over his wire-rimmed glasses at Eudora with a kind of quiet respect that she suspected he did not easily show. "But your standing is solid, Miss Bristol. This land is yours." When they came out of the land office into the afternoon sun, Eudora stopped on the boardwalk and stood very still for a moment. George waited beside her without pushing. He was good at that, she had come to understand, giving space without withdrawing. "Thank you," she said finally, and she meant it with a depth that surprised her. "I could not have known what to look for. I would not have known what it meant." "You knew something was wrong the moment you saw the cut fence," he said. "That was you." "You knew who was doing it and why and what the legal implications were," she said. "That was the rocking sea's 2 years of dealing with Peckett." He paused. Eudora. It was the first time he had used her given name, and they both noticed it. He continued without acknowledging the slip, which was somehow more significant than if he had. "You are not alone in this. I want you to know that." She looked at him for a long moment in the bright afternoon light, this quiet, careful man who had arrived on her land 2 weeks ago as an obligation, and had become, without either of them planning it, someone she relied on in a way that was not purely practical. "I know," she said. "I am beginning to understand that." The business with Peckett did not resolve quickly. Sheriff Dawes was a man of deliberate process who did not believe in rushing legal proceedings, which was maddening to Eudora, and which George counseled patience about with a consistency that both irritated and steadied her. "He is not wrong to be careful," George said one evening while they sat on the repaired porch steps watching the sun go down over the west pasture, which was beginning to look like a pasture again rather than an abandoned field. "A land dispute handled badly becomes a feud that goes on for 20 years. And a land dispute handled timidly becomes an invitation to keep pushing," Eudora said. George was quiet for a moment. "You are right," he said, which surprised her because she had half expected argument. "There needs to be a clear signal that this land has a defender, that the Bristol property is not going to go quietly." "So we put up the fence," she said. "We put up the fence," he agreed. "Properly. Posts sunk deep enough that no one is going to cut them out without serious effort and noise. And we make sure Peckett sees it being done," Eudora added. George looked at her sideways. "You want to tell him we are rebuilding." "I want him to ride by and see us doing it," she said. "I want him to understand that this land has people on it now." Something in his expression that she was learning to read, something that lived in the area around his eyes and the set of his jaw, shifted in a way that might have been admiration. "All right," he said. "We start the south fence tomorrow." They spent 4 days on the south fence. It was hard physical work in the full heat of a West Texas spring, with the sun bearing down from a cloudless sky and the ground hard and uncooperative. Eudora worked every hour of it, digging post holes and stretching wire alongside George. And by the second day, her hands had new blisters and her back ached in ways she had not felt since her teenage years on this same land. On the third afternoon, Roy Peckett did ride by. He came along the south boundary on his side, a heavy-set man with a gray-streaked beard on a well-fed bay horse, and he pulled up and sat watching them work from a distance of about 30 yards. George straightened up from the post he was setting and watched Peckett without expression. Eudora drove the next post into the hole she had dug and picked up the tamping bar without looking at Peckett directly, and then she turned and looked at him with the steady, deliberate regard of someone who had absolutely nothing to be afraid of. "Mr. Peckett," she called across the boundary. He tipped his hat with a gesture that was technically polite and contained nothing actually civil. "Miss Bristol, settling in, are you?" "I have settled," she said. "This is my father's land, and I am putting back what time and neglect have worn down. Every fence line, every post." A pause in which Peckett's eyes moved to George and then back to Eudora. "That your man there?" "That is George Turner," she said. "He knows this kind of work, and so do I." Another pause longer. Peckett turned his horse slowly. "Hard work for a woman alone," he said, with the particular emphasis on alone that was meant to sound like sympathy and was actually a threat. "She is not alone," George said, and his voice was quiet and carried across the distance like a stone dropped in still water. Peckett looked at him for a long moment. Whatever he saw in George Turner's face and posture in that moment apparently concluded the conversation, because he turned his horse and rode back the way he had come without another word. Eudora let out a breath she had not entirely realized she was holding. She looked at George, who had already turned back to the fence post, and she said nothing because nothing needed saying. But something had shifted again, something that now had a direction. The nights at the Bristol ranch were different from the rocking sea, George found. At the rocking sea there was always the sound of other men, the bunkhouse noise and the low talk, and the shared ordinariness of communal male life that George had accepted as the texture of his existence without examining whether it fed him or merely surrounded him. At the Bristol ranch, he slept in the small tack room that Eudora had prepared for him with a bedroll and a lantern and the smell of leather and hay, and the nights were quiet in a way that was different from lonely. He heard the sounds of the ranch. Cattle moving in the dark, the particular call of the night birds along the creek, the house itself settling. And once, around midnight in the third week, a light in the kitchen window that meant Eudora was awake and probably at the table with her account books, which she kept with a precision that impressed him, and which she shared with him every Sunday so he understood the financial position they were working within. He did not knock on the door that midnight. He lay in the dark and thought about why he wanted to, and thought about why he should not, and eventually fell asleep with the question unanswered. But the following Sunday evening, when she spread the account book open on the kitchen table and he sat across from her as he always did now, she looked up from the figures and said, without apparent transition from the numbers, "Why did you really come here, George?" He met her eyes. "Harlan asked me." "That is not what I mean," she said. "Men do what they are told all the time without putting their whole heart into it. You have put your whole self into this place. I want to know why." The directness of it should have closed him off. It was the kind of question he had spent years not answering. But Eudora Bristol asked it without demand, with the open curiosity of someone who genuinely wanted to understand rather than someone laying a trap, and he found, to his own surprise, that he wanted to answer it. "Because it felt like something that mattered," he said carefully. "Something real. I have been very good at what I do for a long time, and it has not always felt like it connected to anything. This," he glanced around the kitchen with its modest furnishings and its evidence of her determined occupation, "this is someone's whole history, someone's family. I wanted to help save it." She was quiet for a long time, looking at him with those direct brown eyes. "And is that all?" she asked softly. The silence between them was full of everything neither of them had said, and it was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that has weight and warmth. "No," he said, "I do not think that is all." She closed the account book without looking away from him. "All right," she said. It was acceptance without pressure, an opening without a deadline, exactly what he needed. He could feel himself unfolding toward her the way a plant turns toward light, slowly and without drama, but with a deep biological certainty. It was another 2 weeks before he touched her, and when it happened it was ordinary and enormous in equal measure. They were in the barn working on the tack together, cleaning and oiling the saddle gear on a Sunday afternoon when the weather was too hot for outdoor work, and she reached across him for the cleaning rag, and he did not move out of her way because he did not want to, and her arm brushed his, and they both went still at exactly the same moment. He turned his head. She was very close, closer than the work required, and her face was at an angle that made the afternoon light catch in her hair, and she was looking at him with an expression that had finally given up pretending not to know what it wanted. He put his hand over hers on the cleaning rag, not taking it, just covering it, asking. She turned her hand over beneath his so that her palm was against his palm, and she held on, and neither of them moved for a long moment while the barn settled around them and a horse shifted in its stall and the heat pressed down on the roof above. "I did not expect you," she said quietly. "I did not expect anything," he said. "Not ever. And then you walked to the gate with a cup of coffee and a list." She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her actually laugh, open and unguarded, and it was the most beautiful sound he had encountered in recent memory. He felt it in his chest like warmth. He lifted her hand and held it against his chest for a moment, his heart working steadily underneath, and she felt it, and her expression became something he could not have described but did not need to. He leaned forward and kissed her, and she kissed him back with the same practical directness she brought to everything. No hesitation and no performance, just honest and warm and entirely present. When they broke apart, she kept her hand in his. They stood that way for a while in the barn, with the Sunday afternoon pressing down outside, and neither of them said anything until she laughed again, softly, and he discovered that he could make himself smile around her in a way that did not feel like armor and did not feel like performance. It felt like relief. The trouble with Roy Peckett came to a head sooner than George had hoped, and in a form he had not entirely anticipated. On a Thursday morning in the first week of June, Sheriff Dawes rode out to the Bristol ranch with a deputy and a formal notice. The notice was not for Eudora. It was from Eudora, countersigned by the land office, formally documenting the trespass and demanding the removal of any Peckett cattle from Bristol land and the restoration of the damaged boundary fence. Dawes delivered it personally because, as he explained over coffee in Eudora's kitchen, he had also paid a visit to Peckett's operation the previous day. "Peckett is not a man who responds to pressure with good sense," Dawes said, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "I want you to be aware that legal process is proceeding, but it may not proceed without friction." "What kind of friction?" George asked. Dawes looked at him with the kind of direct appraisal that law officers learned and that George met without flinching. "The kind that rides by at night," Dawes said. "I am not saying it will happen. I am saying you should be prepared." After Dawes left, Eudora stood at the kitchen window looking out at the yard. George stood in the doorway behind her. "I will keep watch at nights," he said. She turned around. "We will keep watch at nights," she said firmly. "I am not going to be managed and protected like a piece of furniture in my own home." "I know you are not," he said, and his tone was not patronizing but earnest. "I am asking to share the responsibility, not take it." She studied him. "All right," she said. "We will split the nights." They did. For a week nothing happened. Then on a Tuesday night in the second week of June, George was awake in the small hours when he heard horses moving on the south end of the property. He came out of the tack room with his rifle and crossed the yard quietly. There was a lamp still burning in Eudora's window, which meant she was on her watch too, and by the time he reached the edge of the south pasture she was beside him in the darkness, also with a rifle. "South fence," she said quietly. "Two riders," he said, having listened for a moment longer. They moved along the fence line together, staying in the shadow of the mesquite, and when they were close enough they could hear the deliberate sound of wire being worked. George stepped out into the clear and said, loudly and with absolute steadiness, "Stop what you are doing and identify yourselves." There was a scramble, a curse, the sound of horses backing. A lantern swung wildly and then was extinguished. George heard one horse go hard to the south and another moving more frantically. And then a voice from the darkness that was not calm said something he could not quite make out. Eudora was beside him and she said, equally loudly, "I am Eudora Bristol and this is my land and I know exactly what you are doing and I have a witness and a rifle, and I will use one and present the other to Sheriff Dawes in the morning." The second horse went south at a gallop. In the morning, George and Eudora rode to Dawes together and reported exactly what had happened. Dawes listened, made notes, and 3 days later rode out to the Peckett spread with a formal warning and 2 witnesses. Peckett denied everything, but the fence cutting on the Bristol land stopped. It was not entirely over because these things never were entirely over. But the active, escalating threat was broken, and with the fence lines solid and the water reliable and the herd building back toward something sustainable, the Bristol ranch began to look and feel like a living place again. In the space that the crisis left when it ebbed, Eudora and George found each other more fully. He began to talk to her in the evenings the way he had never talked to anyone, carefully at first, and then with increasing ease, about Missouri and his father and the things he had been afraid he carried in his own blood. He told her about the loneliness he had built around himself, and the way he had convinced himself it was preference, and the fact that he was no longer convinced of any such thing. She listened to all of it. She did not offer easy reassurance, which he would not have believed or wanted. She thought about what he told her, and she responded to it honestly, which was more valuable than comfort. "You are not your father," she said one evening, looking at him with the steady certainty of someone who had been paying close attention. "I have watched you for 2 months now. You are careful and patient, and you think before you act, and you are kinder than you know." He was quiet for a long moment. "I am afraid of it still," he admitted. "The closeness, what it asks of you." "I am not asking you to be fearless," she said. "I am asking you to stay." He looked at her. The lamp between them made her face warm and her eyes very clear and direct, and the fullness of what she was offering was not lost on him. Not comfort and not sympathy, but actual invitation. A place in a life, in this life, in the life she was building with her own hands out of what her father had left behind. "I want to stay," he said. It was the most honest sentence he had produced in recent memory, and saying it felt like putting something down that he had been carrying for a very long time. She crossed the kitchen to him, and he stood up from the table, and she put her arms around him in the uncomplicated way of someone who had decided, and he held on with both hands and his face in her hair, and neither of them moved for a long time. Summer came to the Brazos country in earnest, and the Bristol ranch was alive with it. The grass came back in the repaired pastures, and the cattle gained condition, and Eudora's account book began to show a trajectory that was cautiously upward. She planted a kitchen garden along the south side of the house, and George built her a proper fence around it to keep the deer out. And she grew tomatoes and squash and peppers, and the smell of green growing things around the house gave it a quality of permanence and intention that had not been there in March. They worked together every day, and they were honest with each other every evening, and something was building between them that had roots and was not going anywhere, and both of them knew it. In July, Harlan Cook rode out to check on the progress, as he had said he would. He came alone this time, which felt deliberate. He dismounted at the gate and looked around the yard at the repaired barn, and the rebuilt fence and the kitchen garden and the cattle visible in the south pasture, and his expression was of a man who has done something he is genuinely proud of. "George," he said, shaking George's hand with real warmth, "this place looks like itself again." "Miss Bristol did the work," George said. "Both of you did," Harlan said, looking between them with the easy perception of a man who had been watching people for 50 years. "I can see that clear enough." Eudora made coffee, and the three of them sat on the repaired porch and spoke about the ranch's situation. Harlan confirmed what Eudora had been hearing from other sources, that Peckett's operation was in deeper trouble than it appeared, that the man had overstretched himself financially, and the loss of the Bristol land encroachment was one of several pressures closing in on him. The land dispute would likely resolve itself through Peckett's own collapse before it required further legal action. "I owe you an enormous debt," Eudora told Harlan directly, looking at him with the frank seriousness she brought to anything important, not just for the help but for sending the right person. Harlan looked at George again with something fond and knowing. "I always knew he was the right person for something," he said. "I am glad it turned out to be this." After Harlan rode back toward the rocking sea, George and Eudora stood in the yard in the long afternoon light. The summer sky was enormous overhead, the kind of Texas sky that makes you feel small and held at the same time, and the grass moved in a dry, warm breeze, and the cattle were sounds at the edge of hearing, and the ranch was alive. "He knew," Eudora said. "Harlan is not a simple man," George agreed. "He sent you here knowing," she said. "Maybe," George said, "or maybe he just trusted what he knew about both of us and let the rest find its own way." She looked at him sideways. "That is almost poetic." "Do not tell anyone," he said. "I have a reputation." She laughed, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, and the late sun was warm on their faces, and the land that had been close to dying stretched out green and alive around them. The question of what they were to each other, what shape this would take, what the future actually looked like, was one that hovered unspoken through August. Not uncomfortably, but with the particular weight of something important that both parties understood needed to be addressed with the seriousness it deserved. George was the one who brought it into the open. He did it one evening in the way he did most important things, without elaborate ceremony, with the directness that had always been how he moved when something truly mattered to him. He came in from the barn at dusk, and found her at the kitchen table with her books and her figures and the cup of evening coffee that was always there, and he sat down across from her, and did not reach for anything, and did not pretend the conversation was about something else. "I want to know if you see a future with me," he said. "I want to know honestly, because I know what I feel and I am not afraid of it the way I was, and I want to be a man who says what he means when it matters." Eudora closed the account book. She looked at him with those brown eyes that did not hide anything important when she chose not to hide it. "I see a life," she said. "I see this land and you on it here with me. I see the herd we are going to build and the seasons we are going to work through, and I see you at this table 10 years from now, and it does not scare me. It is the only future I can picture and not feel afraid of. Then I am asking you to marry me," he said. It was simple and it was complete and it was entirely him. She was quiet for exactly 3 seconds and then she said, "Yes, George. Obviously, yes." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned it over and held his, and they sat like that in the kitchen of her father's house with the summer dark outside the window and the lamplight between them, and the simplicity of it was what made it feel permanent. They were married in September of 1883, in the small church in Caldwell that Eudora had attended as a child. It was not an elaborate wedding. The church was modest. The congregation was composed of the people they knew and worked with. Harlan Cook sat in the second row with the particular satisfaction of a man who knows he has done right by the world, and Harold Spence from the land office was there in his wire-rimmed glasses, and Sheriff Dawes was there, and a handful of hands from the rocking sea who had worked with George for years, and who came looking both happy for him and faintly bewildered that the man they had never quite been able to get close to had apparently given his whole heart to a woman with an account book and a list. Eudora wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from a merchant in Austin, a deep blue that did remarkable things in the September light, with her hair down for the first time George had seen it, and he stood at the front of that church and watched her come up the aisle with the particular stillness of a man who is fully and utterly present in a moment, not managing it or surviving it, but actually inside it. And something in his face when she reached him made her eyes bright with something she had decided long ago. She was not going to call crying because she was a practical woman. The minister read the words and they spoke the promises, and George put a simple gold ring on her finger, which was the only piece of jewelry she had asked for. And when the ceremony was complete and the minister said they were married, George kissed her with the warmth of someone who had been saving up tenderness for years without knowing it, and had finally found the right place to give it. Harlan Cook shook George's hand in the churchyard afterward, and held it for a moment with both his large ones and said, with the simple directness of a man who had lived long enough to know what mattered, "You are exactly where you are supposed to be, son." George had not been called son by a man who meant it kindly since he was young enough not to understand how rare it was, and the word went through him like warmth. The first year of their marriage was the year the Bristol ranch truly came back to life. They increased the herd through careful buying at the autumn sale in Caldwell, George selecting animals with the deep knowledge of cattle that was one of the most reliable things about him. They repaired the last of the structural problems on the main house, a project that took them through October and November, and that George approached with the same systematic patience he brought to everything. They hired a seasonal hand, a young man named Eli Marsh who came highly recommended from a ranching family north of the county, and who was capable and willing, and who treated Eudora with the matter-of-fact respect that George had established as the baseline without ever needing to make it explicit. Roy Peckett's operation failed formally in November of 1883. The debts outweighed the assets, the land went to a creditor, and Peckett himself left the county without ceremony. The Bristol South boundary was undisputed. The land that James Bristol had homesteaded was safe. Eudora wrote a letter to the registrar at the Santa Fe Mission School in December, explaining that she would not be returning to her teaching position, and the writing of it was the closing of a chapter that she sat with for a day before she felt entirely settled about. George found her at the kitchen table that evening with the sealed letter in front of her and a quietness in her face that was not unhappy but was serious. "Is it the right decision?" he asked, sitting down. "Yes," she said. "Unambiguously yes." She paused, "And I am still allowed to feel the loss of what I left behind." "Of course you are," he said. She looked at him. "I never thought I would want this life," she said. "I thought the land was my father's dream and teaching was mine. I thought they were separate things." "And now," he said, "now I think the land was always in me the way it was in him," she said. "And the teaching, the caring about how people grow and what they need and how to help them learn, that has not gone anywhere. I do not know where it will turn up yet, but it is not lost." She reached out and took his hand across the table. "Nothing I am is lost with you. That is what surprises me most." He brought her hand up and pressed his mouth to her knuckles, which was a thing he did that she had come to love completely because it was particular to him, not something he did for anyone but her. "Nothing I am is lost with you either," he said, "which is more than I knew how to hope for." Spring of 1884 brought new growth in every sense. The pastures were lush with the winter rains. The herd had reached 40 head and was performing well, and in March Eudora told George quietly one morning over breakfast that she was with child. He sat very still for a moment in the way that she had stopped being unsettled by, and had come to understand was how he received large pieces of information, processing fully before responding. Then he came around the table to her and crouched beside her chair and took both her hands in his and looked up at her with an expression that undid her completely because it was so open, so entirely unguarded, joy without any shadow in it. "Are you well?" he asked first, which was so entirely characteristic of him that she almost laughed. "I am very well," she said. He pressed his forehead briefly against their joined hands, which was another thing particular to him, and when he looked up his eyes were bright in a way she had seen precisely twice before, once in the church and once when she had said yes. "I am going to be a different kind of father than I had," he said. It was not a declaration to her. It was a declaration to himself, a promise, and she heard the weight of it. "I know," she said. "I have watched you be a different kind of man than you were afraid of being for a full year now. I know what you are made of." He stood up and pulled her to her feet and held her against him with the particular careful strength of someone who is now responsible for something more precious than anything he has previously been trusted with. Their son was born in November of 1884, a healthy boy they named James George Turner, for her father and for himself. He arrived on a Tuesday evening with the help of the local midwife, a capable woman named Ada Ferris, who had delivered half the county's children over 20 years, and George sat outside the bedroom door for 3 of the longest hours of his life, and emerged when Ada called him in looking like a man who had survived something that had also transformed him entirely. James was put into his arms and George held his son and looked down at this small and complete person, and his face did the thing that it did when something was too large for his usual control, which was simply that it stopped pretending it was not enormous and let the enormity show. He sat in the chair beside Eudora's bed and held his son, and she watched his face and felt a fullness in her chest that was beyond what she had words for. "He looks like you," George said softly. "He has your jaw," she said. "Poor thing," George said, so quietly and so unexpectedly that she laughed, and Ada Ferris looked up from her work with a small smile, and baby James opened his eyes briefly and looked at the light and closed them again. Life on the Bristol Turner Ranch, as the neighbors began calling it, settled into the rhythm of something truly established. They had their disagreements, of course, because two people of strong character and clear opinions who spend every day together in close quarters will find their edges occasionally. But their disagreements had the texture of two people who are fundamentally on the same side and know it, which meant they resolved with honesty and without lasting damage. George expanded the cattle operation in 1885, bringing the herd to nearly 80 head through careful management and the use of improved breeding stock that Harlan Cook helped him source. Eudora began, quietly and without making a large announcement of it, to teach. Not in a formal school, not with any official standing, but she started with Eli Marsh's younger siblings, two children whose parents had settled a claim about 4 miles north and who had no access to schooling whatsoever. And it grew from there the way things grow when they are the right thing, organically and with momentum. Until by the fall of 1885, she had a loose collection of 8 children from neighboring families who came to the Bristol Turner house on Tuesday and Thursday mornings to be taught to read and figure and understand the world by a woman who had always known that this was part of what she was for. George built her a proper schoolroom. It was not large, a single room off the back of the barn with 2 windows and a blackboard that he made himself from a flat board, and a particular paint he sourced from the merchant in Caldwell. He did it without announcement, building it on weekend mornings over 6 weeks, and when it was done, he brought Eudora out to see it, and she stood in the doorway of that small, bright room with its 2 windows and its handmade blackboard and the morning light coming in, and she turned around and looked at him, and there were no appropriate words, and she did not try to find any. She simply walked back to him and held him, and he held her back. Harlan Cook was a regular visitor at the ranch through those years, riding out every few months, aging with the dignity of a man who had worked his body honestly and was at peace with what it had become. He was fond of young James in the uncomplicated way of an old man for a child that represents something continued and good in the world. In the summer of 1886, Eudora was with child again. This time it was a girl, born in January of 1887, whom they named Clara for George's mother, whom he had spoken of rarely but with a tenderness that told Eudora exactly who she had been. Clara was born in the same room as James, and George held her with the ease of a man who has done this before and knows both that it is enormous and that his hands can be trusted. James, who was 2.5 and entirely convinced that he was the center of the known universe, regarded his sister with an expression of profound suspicion that made Ada Ferris laugh and made George say, very seriously, "James, this is Clara. She is yours to look after," which was the right thing entirely, and James looked at Clara again with recalibrated interest. Life on the ranch through those years was not without hardship because life on any working ranch in West Texas in the 1880s was simply not without hardship. There were dry spells and difficult winters and markets that dropped without warning and livestock losses that were inevitable and painful. But none of it broke what Eudora and George had built because what they had built was not fragile. It was made of the same materials as the land itself, hard and honest and full of the kind of stubbornness that looks like faith. In 1888, the school in Caldwell officially recognized Eudora's Tuesday-Thursday teaching and began sending a small annual payment for her work, which she used entirely to buy books, filling the small schoolroom with more volumes than any of the children who came there had ever seen gathered in one place. George made bookshelves for them, simple and solid, and the sight of those shelves filled with books in the room he had built for her remained one of the images of his life that meant the most to him. In the fall of that same year, something happened that neither of them had expected. A letter arrived from Missouri. It was addressed to George Turner and had been routed through 3 different postal points before arriving in Caldwell, and George received it from the post clerk with the careful stillness of a man who has been waiting for something he did not know he was waiting for. He read it that evening at the kitchen table. Eudora sat across from him and did not ask questions, which was her way when he needed time. When he had read it twice, he put it down on the table and looked at the lamplight for a moment. "My father is dead," he said. "He died in the spring." Eudora said nothing and waited. "He died," George said carefully, "and the letter is from my younger brother. I did not know he was still in Missouri. I lost track of him." He paused. "He has a family. He wants to know if I am well." The letter was a small thing and also a very large thing, the way some correspondences are. It was an opening, a hand extended across 11 years of distance and silence. "Do you want to write back?" Eudora asked. "Yes," George said. Then, with the honesty that had always been the architecture of what they were to each other, "and I am afraid of what writing back might open." "It might open nothing more than knowing your brother is alive and well," she said. "That is not nothing." He looked at her. "No," he said, "it is not." He wrote the letter over 2 evenings, and Eudora did not read it unless invited, and was not invited because some things needed to be faced in private first. And when it was written and sealed, George held it in his hands for a moment and then said, "There is nothing in here that would frighten you." "I know," she said. "I wrote about the ranch," he said, "and about you, and about James and Clara." She looked at him. "I told him I had found what I did not know I was looking for," George said. "I told him I thought he should know that it is possible to find your way back from what we came from." She crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him from behind as he sat at the table, and he put his hands over hers on his chest, and neither of them needed to say anything else. The letter was sent. A reply came 3 months later, warm and tentative and real, from a man named David Turner who lived in Jefferson City, Missouri, with a wife named Helen and 3 children. The correspondence continued through the winter, cautious, and then more open, and by the spring of 1889 it had been agreed that David Turner and his family would make the journey to West Texas in the summer. They came in July, arriving on the Caldwell stage looking road-worn and curious, and containing a kind of hope that George recognized as the family trait he had always had difficulty acknowledging in himself. David was like George in the jaw, and the build and the careful quality of his eyes, but lighter somehow, less armored, and his wife Helen was a small, energetic woman who took one look at Eudora and decided they were going to be friends, which they were. The children, 2 boys and a girl between 5 and 9, discovered James and Clara with the explosive enthusiasm of children who have been traveling for days and are delighted by the existence of other children. And within an hour of arrival, they were all at the creek together under Eudora's peripheral supervision, while she and Helen sat on the porch and talked with the ease of 2 people who have both been doing something important alone for a long time and are glad to have found someone who understands it. George and David sat on the other end of the porch and talked, and it was harder and easier than either had expected, which was exactly how things were when they were real. They talked about their father, briefly and honestly, and about Missouri, and about the years in between, and by the end of the afternoon they had not resolved everything, but they had established that they were brothers, and that it was not too late, and that the distance was bridgeable. Over the course of the 2-week visit, the ranch came to life in a way that Eudora had not seen it before, full and noisy and generous with people. George and David worked together on the property for several days, and George watched his brother work and saw none of the things he had feared, and several of the things he had hoped for: competence and care, and a willingness to be alongside someone else without making it a competition. On the last evening of the visit, they all ate together in the yard, the full summer evening spread above them, and Eudora had cooked enough for a small army, and the children were sleeping in various configurations in the house, and George sat with David and Helen and Eudora around the remains of the meal with the summer stars coming out overhead, and the feeling was of something that had been broken for a very long time being gently set back together. Not the same as it had been before the breaking. Better. because the break had been acknowledged, and the repair was chosen, and the joining was between people who understood what they were doing and why. George looked at Eudora across the table in the lamplight, and she looked back at him with the particular clear regard that meant. She was seeing him, entirely, and was entirely there. And he thought about the morning in April of 1883 when she had walked to the gate with a cup of coffee and a list written on the back of a feed receipt, and about Harlan Cook standing in the yard saying keep him as long as you need, and about how that had been the beginning of something that he had not been able to see from the inside of it while it was growing. He could see it now from inside the middle of it, and it was large and alive and entirely real, and it was his. He reached across the table and put his hand over Eudora's hand, and she turned hers over and held on. "Thank you," he said, just to her, quietly enough that it was private. "For what?" she said. "For needing someone," he said. "For letting that someone be me." She smiled at him, the full, unguarded smile that he had been collecting for 6 years like the rarest kind of currency, the one that reached all the way to her eyes and said, "I see you and you are exactly right." "I did not plan for it to be you," she said honestly. "Neither did I," he said. "And yet," she said. "And yet," he agreed. David and Helen returned to Missouri with a promise to come back in the spring, which they did and continued to do for years afterward, until the correspondence became something Eudora and Helen conducted almost weekly, a friendship between women who lived very different lives in very different places, and understood each other with the particular clarity of people who have built their lives on their own terms. Harlan Cook died in the autumn of 1889, peacefully, in the main house of the Rocking Sea, which passed to his son Robert, who was a decent and capable man, and who continued his father's practice of being a good neighbor to the Bristol Turner operation. George rode to the Rocking Sea when he heard, and stood at Harlan's grave in the small family plot on the west rise of the property, and said what he needed to say to the wide Texas sky and the red earth and the man he was burying, and it was enough. Harlan had known what he had done for George Turner when he sent him down the road to a broken-down ranch with a woman and a list, and he had known what it would become, and he had done it with open hands and without requiring anything in return. And that was the nature of genuine generosity, and George had been learning from it for 6 years. He rode home in the late afternoon, and Eudora met him in the yard and held him for a moment without words, and he was grateful beyond expression that this was what he rode home to. The Bristol Turner Ranch grew through the 1890s into something that James Bristol would not have recognized in its scale, but would absolutely have recognized in its character. Hard work and honest accounting and care for the land and care for the animals and care for the people on it. The herd reached 150 head. The schoolroom was expanded twice to accommodate the growing number of children Eudora taught. A second hired hand was brought on permanently alongside Eli Marsh, who had grown from a capable young man into a genuinely indispensable part of the operation, and who had taken a wife from a neighboring family, and was saving toward his own land with George's active encouragement. James grew into a boy of serious intelligence and physical capability, who was outdoors at every opportunity, and who could read cattle by the time he was 8 in the way that his father had always done, which George watched with a quiet pride that was one of the most uncomplicated feelings he had ever experienced. Clara was quieter and more inward and passionate about the schoolroom in a way that Eudora recognized as herself at the same age, and who asked questions that required genuine thought to answer and was dissatisfied with anything less. In 1892, Eudora was with child for the 3rd time, and this child was born in October, another boy they named Henry, small and loud and absolutely certain of his own importance from the first moment of his existence, in a way that had both his parents slightly bewildered and entirely charmed. George Turner was 41 years old that autumn, and he stood in his own yard on the evening of his son Henry's birth, under the enormous Texas sky, and thought about the man he had been when he came to this land, the closed and careful man who had held everyone at arm's length and called it preference, and had almost convinced himself it was true. He thought about what Eudora had said to him once, that nothing he was would be lost with her. He had been afraid of losing himself to closeness, to love, to the vulnerability of being known. What he had found instead was that he was more fully himself than he had ever been, that the love had not diminished him but completed something. Inside the house, Eudora was propped up in bed with Henry in the crook of her arm and James, and Clara on either side of her, all four of them in the warm lamplight, and he could see it from the yard through the window. He stood there for a moment just watching, the way you stand before something beautiful that you are part of, and you want to hold it with your eyes for a moment longer before you go back into it. Then he went inside, and Eudora looked up at him when he came through the door, and her face said everything that they had learned to say to each other over 9 years, and he sat on the edge of the bed and looked down at Henry and then at James and Clara and then at Eudora, and he said simply, "We have done something." She laughed softly so as not to startle the baby. "We have done several things," she said, "and we are going to keep doing them." "Yes," he said, "we are." He reached out and tucked the edge of the blanket more securely around Henry, who was still and warm and perfect, and put his other hand over Eudora's free hand, and she leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, and the night settled over the Bristol Turner Ranch and its people, and the land that James Bristol had homesteaded in 1861 was alive and full, and in the hands of people who loved it, and the future was not a fear but a fact. The wide Brazos country in the fall smelled of dry grass and cool air coming down from the north, and the particular red dust of the road, and the sky was enormous and clear and full of possibility, and the ranch sat in the middle of it like a heart in a chest, beating steady and sure. Kept by two people who had found each other in the ruins of a difficult thing, and built something lasting out of their own two hands, and the particular grace of having been sent to exactly the right place at exactly the right time. Years later, when James and Clara and Henry were grown, when the ranch had passed through a full generation's work and grown into something solid enough to outlast any single person, when Eudora and George sat together in the evenings on the repaired and twice rebuilt porch of the house that had been James Bristol's dream and was now theirs together, they sometimes talked about those early days. The fence cutting and the well drilling and the account books, and the long Sundays on the porch, watching the sun go down over the west pasture. "What would you have done?" George asked her once on one of those evenings when the light was low and warm and the ranch was quiet around them, "if Harlan Cook had not come that morning?" Eudora was quiet for a moment, turning the question over. "I would have managed," she said finally. "I would have done it alone, or I would have found some other way. I was not going to lose this place." "No," he said, "you were not. But it would have been just that," she said. "Managing, surviving, getting through." She looked at him with the direct brown gaze that had not changed in 20 years except to become more itself. "You turned it into something else, into more than just holding on." He looked out at the pasture in the fading light. "Harlan said keep him as long as you need," he said. "He made it sound like a loan." "He knew it was not," she said. "Yes," George said. "I think he knew." She reached over and took his hand, and he held hers as they had done at this table and in this yard and across this land for 20 years. The stars were coming out above the Brazos country, the same stars that had been there when James Bristol first put a stake in this ground and laid claim to his piece of the world, the same stars that Eudora had looked up at as a girl, and as a woman coming home to ruin, and as a wife and mother rebuilding what ruin had taken. George Turner, who had arrived on this land as a borrowed thing, a kindness extended by a generous man, sat on the porch of his own home with his wife's hand in his and the sounds of his children's lives around him, and the land he had helped save stretching out to every horizon, and he was as far from borrowed as a man could be. He was home. He had been home for 20 years. He was going to be home for the rest of his life. And that was exactly as it should be.